A 29-page diary preserved inside the archives of St. Louis University begins with a line that chills the spine. Scratches heard from the walls, the boy was asleep. The date was March 1949. The child in question, recorded under the pseudonym Roland Doe, was later revealed to be a real boy named Ronald Hunkler. Doctors had examined him, confirming he was paralyzed from exhaustion after weeks of strange disturbances. Yet in the stillness of that night, priests swore the sounds of claws echoed inside the family's modest house. But there were no animals in the room. Only a terrified child, and marks on his skin that seemed to rise from nowhere. This was the haunting that would inspire The Exorcist. Not a Hollywood invention, but a case that unfolded in suburban Washington, D.C., and later in St. Louis, where Catholic priests fought what they described as a true demonic possession. And tonight, we're stepping inside that story. Quick pause, where are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Comment below. It's always wild to see these sleepless stories circle the globe. And if you're new here, subscribe so you don't vanish before the ending. In 1949, post-war America was supposed to be about new beginnings, baby booms, suburban houses, and optimism. But hidden inside one family home in Cottage City, Maryland, something far darker was stirring. It began with faint scratching behind the walls, furniture sliding across the floor, and a strange fixation the boy had with a Ouija board. At first, the family tried to dismiss it. Maybe it was mice. Maybe it was a restless teenager's tricks. But the activity escalated in ways that rattled even the most skeptical minds. A heavy bed shook violently in the middle of the night. The boy's body bore red welts, letters and shapes, that appeared as if carved from invisible blades. His voice changed, and the fear in his mother's eyes grew unbearable. Priests were called. Doctors, too. And what they found would defy both medicine and reason. From Georgetown classrooms to a small house in St. Louis, the case of Roland Doe's exorcism left behind documents, eyewitness testimony, and a trail of skeptics who tried to explain it all away. Yet the question lingers even now, did a young boy truly face a demonic force? Or was this a story born of trauma, belief, and fear? What we know for certain is this: the case shook everyone who touched it. Teachers, priests, doctors, and one Jesuit who kept writing, line after line, until the pages were soaked in nightmare. But before we move forward, I want to know something from you. He opened the door to the boy's room, and what he saw ended his career forever. But before I tell you, I want to know, have you ever been so scared you quit your job on the spot? Tell me below. To understand why this story took root the way it did, we have to step into 1949 America, a world that feels familiar in some ways, and utterly foreign in others. The Second World War had ended only a few years earlier. Soldiers had come home, suburbs were rising, and people were chasing the comfort of televisions and the hum of refrigerators in their kitchens. Families gathered around radios at night, listening for voices that reassured them the worst was over. But the shadows of the war hadn't entirely lifted. Trauma lingered quietly in veterans, in widows, in children born to grief. It was a time when the strange and unexplained could easily slip through the cracks of daily life. And within that fragile optimism, faith was everywhere. America in the late 1940s was deeply rooted in Christian traditions, with Catholicism playing a powerful role in places like Washington, D.C. and St. Louis, Missouri. The Catholic Church, with its old rituals, incense, and Latin prayers, carried an air of mystery. To the faithful, priests weren't just men, they were guardians against the forces of darkness. And then came this boy. A boy who seemed to be targeted by something invisible, something malicious. His case was reported not in hushed whispers, but in bold print. The Washington Post printed a story in August of 1949 with the headline, "Priest Frees Empty Rainier Boy Reported Held in Devil's Grip." That single headline transformed a private nightmare into a public phenomenon. Suddenly, the entire region was whispering about the haunted boy from Cottage City, Maryland. At the same time, universities like Georgetown and St. Louis University became unlikely stages for one of the most famous paranormal investigations in American history. Behind closed doors, Jesuit priests, educated men of science and theology, were being pulled into a fight that defied both. Imagine it, the quiet stone halls of Georgetown, the scent of chalk and candle wax, a world of academia suddenly facing stories of beds shaking, voices muttering in Latin, and a child's body contorting in impossible ways. For priests like Father William Bowdern and Father Raymond Bishop, this was not folklore, it was duty. But this wasn't just a clash of faith and fear. It was also a time of cultural contradiction. Psychiatry was gaining ground, with hospitals diagnosing hysteria and psychosomatic illness, while at the very same time, communities believed in curses, spiritual warfare, and the devil's hand at work in everyday life. This tension, the scientific against the supernatural, created fertile ground for the story of Roland Doe to become more than a local haunting. It became a test case for the boundaries of belief. And that belief would soon be tested inside one quiet house in Maryland, when the first strange signs began to rattle the Doe family at night. At first it was scratching, then objects moving on their own. But the most disturbing part, the marks that rose on the boy's skin like a message from something no one could see. It began quietly. Just after winter turned to spring in Cottage City, Maryland, the boy's family started to hear a sound. At first, it was faint, like a mouse scratching behind the walls. Harmless, easy to ignore. But soon, the scratching grew louder, sharper, until it seemed to travel across the ceilings and floors. Some nights, it echoed so fiercely that the family swore something alive was crawling through the rooms. But when they checked, there was nothing. No rats, no mice. Only silence, and a boy, wide-eyed in his bed. The family began to notice other things too. A heavy bed would shift several inches on its own, as if someone unseen had shoved it. A chair would slide unprovoked, scraping across the wood floor. The boy's blankets would be pulled back by invisible hands. And then, the marks appeared. Thin red welts rising on his skin, spelling out words and shapes as though cut by a knife from beneath the flesh. One evening, a family member swore she saw the letters St. Louis scratched into his chest, an omen of the journey to come. There were sounds too, low growls, guttural voices, muttered syllables that the boy could not possibly have known. When relatives leaned in close, they heard him whisper strange phrases in Latin. Latin, a language the child had never studied. But the most unsettling detail was his sudden fascination with a simple game, the Ouija board. He and a beloved aunt had played with it just weeks earlier, asking innocent questions. That same aunt soon fell gravely ill and died. After her death, the boy began to claim he could hear her voice in the room. The scratching often followed. Neighbors noticed the change. Teachers spoke of his withdrawn, distracted behavior. And within the family, the atmosphere grew heavy with dread. They didn't call it possession yet. They just knew something unnatural had invaded their home. By now, nights had become impossible. Furniture moved without touch, objects flew across the room, and the boy would scream in terror, claiming hands were gripping him, holding him down. His parents, desperate and exhausted, turned to their local Lutheran pastor for help. But what he witnessed in that house was more than he could manage. The pastor's advice was chilling in its simplicity. You need the Catholics. And so, the stage was set. With a frightened family and a boy tormented by unseen forces, the case was about to pass into the hands of Jesuit priests, men trained in ritual, in prayer, and in confronting what they believed were the darkest spirits of all. The story of Roland Doe, or Ronald Hunkler, as later research revealed, cannot be told without the people and places that surrounded him. For haunting tales are never just about the afflicted, they are about the witnesses who chose to stay, and the walls that remember. Let's begin with the boy himself. Born in 1935, Ronald was described as shy, intelligent, and unusually close to his Aunt Harriet, the very aunt who first introduced him to the Ouija board. When Harriet passed away suddenly in early 1949, Ronald's grief seemed to open a door to something unseen. His family tried to comfort him, but the boy's nights became filled with voices, scratches, and violent tremors that no parent could soothe. The first clergyman called was Pastor Luther Miles Schulz, a Lutheran minister from the family's community in Cottage City, Maryland. He witnessed enough disturbance in the boy's room, bed shaking, objects sliding, that he advised the family to seek help from the Catholic Church. This step would bring in a new set of figures, men who would carry the story into legend. Foremost among them was Father William S. Bowdern, a Jesuit priest stationed in St. Louis, Missouri. Tall, serious, and deeply faithful, Bowdern would eventually lead the exorcism rituals. He was joined by Father Raymond J. Bishop, also a Jesuit, who would quietly record every chilling detail in a 29-page diary that remains the backbone of this case today. Bishop's steady hand ensured that what happened in that bedroom would not vanish into rumor, but live on in precise, unnerving detail. A younger Jesuit, Father Walter Halloran, would also become central to the story. Halloran was called in to assist, and years later, in interviews, he confirmed details of what he had seen: words appearing on the boy's skin, objects moving without touch, and the boy's violent resistance during rituals. Halloran's testimony, given decades later, is one of the few first-hand confirmations beyond the diary itself. But this haunting wasn't confined to one house. It traveled with the boy. It began in the modest two-story home in Cottage City, a quiet neighborhood where the sound of scratching filled the family's nights. From there, disturbances followed him to relatives' homes in Mount Rainier, Maryland, and eventually, the family sought refuge with extended kin in St. Louis, Missouri. That move, prompted by exhaustion and desperation, shifted the haunting stage. In St. Louis, priests from St. Louis University and the local archdiocese took the case with grim seriousness. The boy was moved at times to Election Brothers Hospital, where the final chapters of the exorcism unfolded. Each location became imprinted with fear: the Cottage City house where it began, the Mount Rainier home where furniture crashed in the night, the St. Louis residence where priests gathered for prayers, and the hospital where a final confrontation took place. Even today, some of those buildings stand. The Exorcist house, in St. Louis, on Roanoke Drive, is still whispered about, its walls rumored to hold the echo of prayers and screams. Paranormal investigators, ghost tour guides, and curious travelers still point to it as one of the most haunted houses in America. Now that the cast of figures has entered the stage, the boy, his family, the priests, and the houses that held the terror, our story shifts. The strange scratching and quiet disturbances would soon erupt into full chaos: violent fits, levitation, and words carved into flesh. By the time Ronald arrived in St. Louis, the disturbances had evolved into something no family could dismiss as childish tricks. The diary of Father Raymond J. Bishop describes nights that slipped from unease into chaos, nights when faith and reason seemed powerless. The boy's body no longer rested. As priests recited prayers, his bed would tremble so violently that assistants had to hold it down. His voice, once soft and ordinary, would twist into guttural tones, mocking the Latin prayers with curses spat back in perfect rhythm. And then there were the marks. Witnesses described words and shapes appearing on his chest and legs, angry welts rising as though burned into flesh. At times, the word hell seared itself across his body. One evening, the word exit appeared, as if some unseen presence was signaling its hold. The most infamous mark spelled St. Louis, predicting the very city where the final battle would unfold. In one terrifying session, objects in the room began to fly, candles toppling, a Bible crashing to the floor. A heavy chair slid across the room without a hand touching it. The diary notes the boy screamed that spirits were throwing them. Perhaps most unsettling of all were the moments when his body seemed to defy natural restraint. One Jesuit assistant swore the boy's body levitated off the bed, rising several inches before crashing down. Father Walter Halloran, decades later, admitted that he could not explain what he saw, but he would not deny it either. At times, the boy's strength grew so great that it took multiple men to restrain him. During one violent thrashing, the bed's springs snapped, and a priest's arm was slashed open. Blood filled the room, turning prayer into panic. Between these fits came moments of eerie calm. The boy's eyes would roll back, his voice whispering in languages he had never studied. Priests claimed he spoke in Latin phrases that mirrored their prayers, an impossibility for a child his age, raised in an English-speaking household. The family's nights stretched into weeks of this torment. Daylight brought little relief. Windows shattered. Neighbors heard screams in the night. Each new witness added fuel to the whispered belief that this was no illness, no game of imagination. It was possession. And so, the rituals continued. Priests rotated in and out, exhausted from days of chanting, fasting, and spiritual combat. One by one, they left shaken, their faith tested. Only Father Bowdern remained steadfast, determined to finish what he believed was a fight for a boy's soul. But the haunting was far from over. Because one night, as Father Bowdern pushed deeper into the ritual, Ronald's body convulsed violently, his eyes rolling white. He opened his mouth, and what came out silenced the entire room. But before I tell you exactly what he said, I need to ask, if you were standing in that room, and you saw a child speak in a voice that wasn't his own, would you stay, or would you run? Tell me below. It was April of 1949 when the exorcism reached its most dangerous moment. Weeks of relentless prayers had already left Father Bowdern and his fellow priests drained, their voices raw from chanting, their nerves stretched thin. But that night, the room seemed different. The air grew colder, thicker, as if charged with something unseen. The boy lay in bed, his face pale, his eyes darting wildly. Then, without warning, his body stiffened, and a sound emerged that no one present would ever forget. Witnesses described it as a roar, guttural and animalistic, tearing from his throat with such force it rattled the walls. Father Bishop's diary records that the boy screamed in voices that were not his own. At one moment, his words came in perfect Latin, words he could not have known, mocking the prayers hurled against him. Then came a high-pitched shriek, a voice that some said sounded like a child begging for mercy. Suddenly, his body levitated off the bed, the sheets wrapping around him like a cocoon. The priests pressed harder, commanding the spirit to reveal itself. And then, the word appeared. On his chest, as if carved by invisible claws, a single word surfaced. Evil. The welt swelled red, burning against his skin as those present watched helplessly. Father Halloran, who tried to hold the boy down, would later testify to seeing the marks form in real time, his rational mind unable to explain what his eyes confirmed. In the chaos, objects in the room began to crash. A small side table toppled on its own. The boy's pillow tore open, feathers scattering through the air like snow in a storm. The prayers grew louder, desperate, as Father Bowdern demanded the entity name itself. And then silence. The boy's eyes rolled back, his mouth opened, and with a guttural hiss, a name was spoken. Some records claimed the voice said, Satan. Others reported the word, Legion. Whatever the truth, every man in that room believed they were facing not a mere spirit, but something darker, something ancient. The violence reached its peak when the boy broke free from the bed, thrashing with a strength no child could possess. In one violent convulsion, he slashed Halloran's arm with a broken spring, drawing blood. Yet even as the priests wrestled him back down, they did not stop praying. Hours passed. The attacks came in waves. And then, the room grew still. The boy collapsed onto the mattress, drenched in sweat, his breathing shallow but steady. For a moment, they believed it was over. But in truth, this was only the eye of the storm. After the exorcism's violent peak, the story could not stay confined to the walls of the boy's bedroom. Word spread slowly at first, whispered among family, neighbors, and clergy. Then journalists began to probe, detectives took notes, and medical professionals started to examine the case with skepticism and curiosity in equal measure. Doctors who had seen Ronald Hunkler were puzzled. They could not explain the bruises, the welts, or the strange contortions of his body. Some suggested hysteria, stress, or even psychosomatic manifestations. Others proposed that the boy had developed an attention-seeking pattern under extreme emotional pressure. Yet none could convincingly explain the phenomena documented in Father Raymond Bishop's diary: the levitations, the objects moving without contact, the Latin phrases emerging from a child who had never studied the language. Parapsychologists were called in, curious to test the limits of science against what appeared to be a paranormal assault. Joseph Banks Rhine, the father of modern parapsychology at Duke University, reviewed the case through letters and interviews. He remained cautious, noting that while extraordinary claims were made, there was no empirical evidence to prove supernatural activity beyond doubt. Journalistic investigations offered their own lens. The skeptical Inquirer, decades later, attempted to trace the boy's true identity, uncovering that Roland Doe was actually Ronald Hunkler, and cross-referencing family testimony, archival records, and interviews. These investigations confirmed some details, dates, locations, the presence of Jesuit priests, but challenged others. The more dramatic accounts, like beds flying across rooms or priests being physically injured by invisible forces, remained unverified. Skeptics argued that imagination, fear, and family stress could amplify ordinary events into the extraordinary. Some noted the boy's earlier exposure to Ouija boards and folk stories about demons, suggesting that a combination of cultural belief and psychological pressure could explain much of the apparent possession. Others highlighted the role of attention, trauma, and peer influence, arguing that legends tend to grow in the retelling, especially when priests and journalists are involved. Yet even with skepticism, the documentation itself, the diary, Halloran's testimony, and Allen's reconstruction, refused to be dismissed entirely. The diary contained timestamps, detailed sequences of events, and consistent observations of phenomena across multiple witnesses. The priests were trained men of faith, but also of discipline and order. Their presence lent weight to the reports that went beyond mere family anecdote. And so the narrative split. One side embraced science, logic, and reason. The other leaned on belief, ritual, and the inexplicable. Both were necessary to understand what truly unfolded in that St. Louis bedroom. If you want to understand the terror of what happened, the diary is only part of the picture. The voices of those who were there, the priests, the family, the neighbors, carried the sound of fear, disbelief, and devotion. Father Walter Halloran, who assisted in the exorcism, recounted decades later that the boy's room often felt impossibly cold, even in the middle of spring. He remembered furniture shifting without touch, bedsheets wrapping around the boy as if moved by invisible hands. "I tried to hold him down," Halloran said in a rare interview, "and I could feel him fight me with a strength I knew no child could possess. And yet his eyes were terrified. It was like he was trapped inside himself." Father Bowdern, who led the rituals, described the Latin prayers as both shield and incantation. "Every time we recited, we felt a resistance," he wrote in a letter years later. "The room would tense. Objects would move. And then the boy, he would speak in a voice that was not his own. It was guttural, mocking, almost alive. I have never experienced anything like it before or since." The family's accounts are no less chilling. Ronald's mother described waking to the sound of scratches crawling across walls, followed by whispers of her son's voice, but twisted, threatening, sometimes unrecognizable. She recalled one night when a crucifix fell from the wall and landed inches from her head. "It was as if the room itself was alive," she said. Neighbors too reported strange incidents. One neighbor, Mrs. L., told reporters that she had seen shadows moving inside the windows when the family was away. "It didn't look like anyone was there," she said. "But the lights flickered, and the room felt wrong. You couldn't ignore it." Even the diary itself reads like a witness speaking from the edge of disbelief. Father Bishop meticulously noted every incident: the bed moving, the boy levitating, the welts forming in words, the disembodied voices repeating prayers and curses simultaneously. Each line is detailed, time-stamped, and horrifying in its ordinariness. There's no embellishment in the rhythm of observation, only the slow build of horror over weeks. And yet, what makes these testimonies so haunting isn't just the violence or the marks, it's the human reaction to them. Fear, doubt, prayer, and exhaustion are all present in equal measure. You can almost hear the priest's voices grow hoarse, see the family's despair, feel the tension in a neighbor's hallway. These are real people, caught in a situation that defied understanding, As the priests left detailed records, and as families shared their accounts, artifacts began to accumulate, evidence, however fragile, that the haunting had left a physical trace. Pages soaked in ink, photographs of rooms frozen in time, and properties where the events unfolded all became part of a lasting legacy. Even decades later, traces of what happened in Cottage City, Mount Rainier, and St. Louis remain. They are subtle, almost imperceptible, but for those who look closely, they tell a story that refuses to die. The most tangible evidence is the 29-page diary of Father Raymond J. Bishop. Every page is a window into nights of fear, cataloging scratches on walls, levitations, strange voices, and the boy's transformation under duress. The diary captures moments that no one could fully explain, and it preserves the details of ritual prayers, dates, and times, the skeletal frame of the haunting itself. Scholars and paranormal investigators alike have pored over it, noting that even decades later, the patterns of events align with the family and priest's testimonies. Physical artifacts are harder to confirm but no less compelling. Visitors to the St. Louis Exorcist house, the home on Roanoke Drive where some of the final exorcism sessions took place, often report a lingering chill in certain rooms, odd shadows, or a sense of being watched. Some claim that scratches and marks remain in hidden corners, faint but visible to those who know where to look. Photographs exist too, though few are publicly released. Some depict the interior of the house, the bedroom set up for the ritual, and objects arranged exactly as the priests described. Feathers from pillows torn during fits are said to have been preserved, alongside other personal items, as silent witnesses to the ordeal. Even hospital records survive, noting Ronald's extended exhaustion and the medical observations of bruises and injuries. These documents corroborate portions of the story, though skeptics argue they only prove a physically stressed child, not a supernatural one. Paranormal investigators have returned repeatedly to these sites, employing modern equipment, infrared cameras, EMF detectors, and digital recorders. Some claim to capture unexplained phenomena, flickering lights, cold spots, disembodied whispers. Others find only ordinary environmental readings. Either way, the artifacts, diary pages, photographs, furniture, and the houses themselves anchor the story in reality. Cultural traces also endure. The Exorcist steps, in Georgetown, immortalized in William Peter Blatty's novel and the 1973 film, continue to draw tourists, skeptics, and believers alike. The legacy of the diary and eyewitness accounts ensures that the story lives not only in memory but also in objects, architecture, and the whispers of those who walk the same floors. These remnants remind us that legends are built on tangible traces, ink on paper, worn floorboards, and the quiet testimony of objects. But what happens when a story leaves its house and steps into the world at large? That is where our tale enters the hearts and minds of millions. The story of Roland Doe did not end with the final exorcism. Its echoes traveled far beyond Cottage City, St. Louis, and the bedrooms of terrified families. It seeped into culture, literature, and the collective imagination, a case study in fear, faith, and the limits of human understanding. Most famously, it inspired William Peter Blatty to write The Exorcist in 1971, later adapted into the 1973 film that became a cultural phenomenon. But the influence goes deeper than cinema. The case shaped modern ideas of demonic possession, exorcism, and the very way we interpret paranormal events. For decades, priests, psychologists, and investigators would reference the incident as the benchmark for what true possession might look like, if it exists. Psychologically, the story taps into universal fears: the vulnerability of children, the invisible threats lurking in familiar spaces, and the battle between rational thought and belief in the unseen. Cognitive scientists have long noted that haunted experiences often combine trauma, suggestion, and environmental cues to create vivid memories. In Ronald's case, the combination of grief, fear, family tension, and religious influence may have amplified extraordinary events into extraordinary terror. Yet the legend persists, not only because of the diary and eyewitness testimony, but because of its cultural imprint. Countless documentaries, books, and paranormal investigations revisit the story, each adding their own layer of interpretation. Ghost tours in St. Louis and Georgetown direct attention to sites associated with the haunting. Online forums and YouTube videos dissect every detail, replaying the events for new audiences in a never-ending loop of curiosity and dread. Even skeptics acknowledge the story's influence. Beyond its supernatural claims, it became a lens for examining fear itself, how stories spread, how belief magnifies perception, and how an incident in a modest home in Maryland can ripple across decades and continents. And yet, amid all this cultural absorption, one question remains: what truly happened in that house? Was it a child under extreme stress, a paranormal event, or something that defies explanation entirely? Some say the spirit world waits quietly in corners of our homes, patient and unseen. Others argue it is merely the shadow of our own minds, projected into the darkness. But every witness, every diary page, every whispered legend insists there was something extraordinary in that St. Louis bedroom. Before we reveal the final sleepless question, I need to ask you, if you were standing on those haunted steps, or inside that room at night, would you dare to enter? Or would you flee into the dark? Comment below. After decades, the story of Roland Doe, or Ronald Hunkler, remains one of the most infamous cases of alleged demonic possession in modern history. From Cottage City, Maryland, to St. Louis, Missouri, the haunting left indelible marks, in diaries, in artifacts, in eyewitness accounts, and in the collective imagination of a world captivated by fear. The priests who witnessed it, the family who endured it, and the neighbors who glimpsed it all agreed on one thing: it was unlike anything they had ever encountered. The physical signs, levitation, objects moving without touch, scratches forming words on flesh, combined with the psychological terror, created a reality that defied rational explanation. Skeptics will argue it was stress, hysteria, or suggestion. Believers will insist it was something beyond our understanding. The truth, perhaps, lies somewhere in the space between. And yet, the story's impact is undeniable. It shaped modern horror, inspired literature and film, and influenced how people understand the boundaries between science, faith, and the supernatural. Ghost tours trace the footsteps of the events. Paranormal investigators return to the sites. Scholars examine the diaries, cross-referencing dates, rituals, and testimonies. The story lives on, not only in books or films, but in whispers, in shadows, in the subtle chill that creeps down the spine when the night grows still. Some claim the houses themselves still carry echoes of the events, drafts where no doors are open, faint scratches appearing on walls, and fleeting shadows in corners that vanish when observed directly. Perhaps the spirits of the past linger. Perhaps it is our own minds, reaching into darkness for stories that explain what frightens us most. And here is the lingering thought, the question that ties the entire tale together, a question that has haunted everyone who has studied this case, and one that remains unanswered to this day. If you ever had to spend a night there, would you keep the lights off? Or would you run? Because in that silence, in the quiet spaces of houses long since emptied, the echoes of Roland Doe may still whisper, waiting to see who dares to listen.